In 2026, archaeologists reached a Maya place that LiDAR had outlined 13 years earlier, but no road reached. What stopped them was not the 13-meter pyramid or the plazas, it was the stone evidence. 14 altars and stelae were documented near a causeway, several apparently altered in antiquity. At the pyramid, Stela, one still carries the sign 5 Ajaw, AD 849, and an apparent scene of decapitation. Yet the deeper question is not only what that image was meant to say, it is why later people intervened in these political monuments rather than leave them unchanged. The researchers gave the site a modern name, Minanbe. Its ancient name remains unknown. Its documented nucleus is modest in scale, about 15 hectares, and the team reported no obvious signs of recent looting. Two facts therefore sit side by side. In AD 849, authority here was still being declared through monumental imagery of lethal power. Later, other people altered at least some of those declarations. This is a story about what rulers tried to fix permanently in stone and what later hands did with those same stones. The northern Calakmul Biosphere Reserve is a densely modified ancient landscape of settlements, terraces, and waterworks. Archaeological traces are often continuous. It can be hard to tell where one community ended and another began. LiDAR can reveal shapes beneath the canopy, mounds, platforms, and causeways. But it cannot identify a ruler, read an eroded glyph, explain why a stone was broken, or tell us whether an object is still where its makers placed it. Only fieldwork turns geometry into evidence. In the Calakmul forest, that distinction matters. Digital relief can show an expedition where to walk. It cannot supply chronology, meaning, or agency. Those questions begin when architecture, ceramics, inscriptions, and the positions of objects are studied together on the ground. For Minanbe, that meant creating an approach where none existed. Abandoned logging tracks sometimes provide imperfect routes into the reserve, but none reach this location. Workers from the community of Constitution and the research team cut approximately 5 kilometers of trail so all-terrain vehicles could carry water, food, and equipment closer. Then the expedition continued another 5 to 6 kilometers on foot. The journey gave the site its modern name. Minanbe derives from Yucatec Maya words meaning, approximately, there is no road. It is not the city's ancient name. That name, if it survives anywhere, has not yet been identified. When the team arrived, digital geometry became architecture. Plazas opened between overgrown buildings. Terraces changed the natural slope. Water channels crossed wet ground. A pyramid temple rose more than 13 meters. Carved stones stood or lay near a causeway linking the central and northeastern sectors. The isolation had protected something essential. Archaeologists reported no obvious evidence of recent looting. This was not a city frozen in perfect condition. Rain eroded limestone, roots entered masonry, buildings collapsed, and ancient people themselves changed the site. But modern treasure hunters had not recently torn the monuments from their relationships with the surrounding architecture. That context would become crucial. Some disorder around the stones was not simply damage to be ignored, it was evidence to be explained. Before asking who changed the monuments, however, we must ask why a relatively modest city needed so many of them. Minanbe's documented nucleus covers about 15 hectares. Against the scale of the great Maya capitals, it is modest. This was not another Calakmul, and its location in the same broad region does not prove political dependence on that city. Yet size can mislead. A smaller political center could organize local labor, manage land and water, exchange agricultural surplus, stage ceremonies, and negotiate with other authorities. Minanbe's exact position in the regional network remains unknown, but its architecture shows more than an isolated cluster of households. The center contained plazas bordered by buildings interpreted as palatial and religious, terraces, wetlands with channels, and a causeway connecting the central area with a northeastern sector. Its tallest documented structure was a pyramid temple more than 13 meters high, built with features associated with the Rio Bec architectural tradition, including carefully cut masonry and moldings. These structures organize movement and attention. A plaza gathered people and directed their gaze. A temple raised ceremony above those watching below. A causeway guided movement between important spaces. Architecture made authority visible before a single glyph was read. Near one end of the causeway, the team registered 14 stelae and altars. Hundreds of photographs were used to create three-dimensional models of their eroded surfaces for study. Maya stelae often portrayed rulers in formal dress and connected their actions to calendrical time. Inscriptions could record ceremonies, accessions, captives, victories, or relationships between royal houses. Nearby altars could form settings for offerings and public ritual. Stone transformed a temporary performance into a claim intended to outlive everyone present. 14 monuments do not make Minanbe an empire. They reveal something more useful: repeated investment in political memory. Across generations, authorities here considered it important to show who possessed status, when important acts occurred, and how the community should remember them. One damaged monument, designated Monument 6, may carry the earliest date yet recognized at the site. Its front shows a ruler wearing a feathered headdress, necklaces, wrist ornaments, and a decorated chest piece. Hieroglyphic blocks survive along its sides. One contains part of a long count date that probably points to the late 7th century. The monument does not give us permission to invent a dynasty. The ruler's name is not securely known. The date is partial. We do not know what event the image originally commemorated. What survives is the design of the claim. Costume separates the figure from ordinary people. The inscription places the display inside sacred and historical time. The stone tells its audience that this person mattered and that this order deserved to endure. The stones were meant to speak forward. Nearly 2 centuries later, someone at Minanbe was still speaking through carved stone, but the surviving image was far more violent. At the base of the pyramid temple, researchers found 3 stelae. Stela 1 is eroded, but its central action remains visible. One figure appears to hold a knife or axe-like implement while decapitating another. Near the top is the calendrical sign 5 Ajaw, corresponding to AD 849. The scene is compelling precisely because we cannot finish its story. It does not prove that an execution took place at Minanbe or securely identify the figures. The image could commemorate a captive, a victory, ritual violence, or a mythic episode. A carved image is not a photograph of an event, but neither is it neutral. Someone selected this scene. Someone joined violent domination to calendrical time. Someone wanted viewers to see one figure controlling the body of another and wanted that relationship to survive in stone. That is why AD 849 matters. It is not the date Minanbe died. The site's ceramics, construction sequence, and wider chronology remain under study. The sign establishes something narrower. At a late moment in the Classic period, authority at Minanbe was still being expressed through monumental imagery of lethal power. The project's epigrapher has suggested that some, perhaps much, of the monument group may have been erected around this period. Decipherment is continuing, and that possibility should not be turned into a fixed date for every stone. Placed beside the probable late 7th century date of Monument 6, Stela 1 creates a sequence rather than a single episode. The earlier monument presents royal status through regalia and inscription. The later one intensifies the surviving image through domination. Between them lie generations we cannot yet reconstruct. Did a later authority descend from the earlier ruler, or did a new group borrow an older political language? Was Stela 1 celebrating victory, renewing ritual authority, or compensating for weakness? The evidence does not choose among those possibilities. Yet the date sharpens the central question. Why was anyone still proclaiming this kind of certainty in 849, when political certainty across much of the Maya lowlands was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain? The classic Maya collapse was not a single event. There was no universal final year and no moment when Maya people disappeared. Across the lowlands, centers transformed unevenly between the 8th and 10th centuries as conflict, shifting long-distance relationships and environmental stress interacted with local decisions. Some declined early, Others persisted or reconfigured. Maya communities continued, and millions of Maya people live today. A D-849 belongs inside this long regional transformation, not at its end. Stela 1 cannot serve as Minanbe's death certificate. It tells us that a monument carried that date, not when the last household left, or whether occupation ended suddenly. Yet the late date changes how we hear its message. When authority is secure, a monument can present power as effortless. When authority is contested, the same monument may become persuasion. The image can insist on control precisely because control is no longer guaranteed. This does not prove Minanbe was in crisis. Stela 1 could commemorate a genuine victory or a ritual statement during a period of local strength. But political confidence performed against uncertainty remains a possibility. The more unstable the world, the greater the need to carve stability into stone. Minanbe's architecture amplified whatever message was intended. The pyramid raised ceremony above the plaza. The causeway guided people past monuments that joined rulers, violence, and time into a public language. The message may have been simple: power still exists here. It was meant to outlive doubt. Instead, the physical context suggests that later people approached at least some of the monuments and changed how they occupied the city. The question is no longer whether the original message survived intact. It is what later hands did with it, and why. At a recently looted site, destruction often has an obvious purpose. Pits are driven into structures in search of burials or valuable objects. Carved surfaces may be cut away for sale. Once that happens, the relationship between objects and place is permanently damaged. Minanbe showed no obvious traces of such recent activity. That allows another possibility to emerge. Some disorder around its monuments is ancient evidence. Several stones appear to have been deliberately altered. Some were fractured, others were moved or placed in unusual positions. A large rectangular altar probably once rested on cubic supports, but was found displaced. Monument 6, with its elaborately dressed ruler and probable late 7th century date, was broken. This is the moment when damage becomes part of the investigation. A single fallen stone could be explained by roots, erosion, or collapse. A broader pattern of selected carved monuments being fractured or repositioned suggests human intention. According to Spreich, the altered monuments all carry glyphs. The pattern appears selective. Yet intention is not the same as explanation. Moving or damaging a monument can mean many things. It can humiliate an earlier ruler, close the ritual power of an object, incorporate it into a new ceremony, or preserve a sacred stone while changing what it is allowed to say. Destruction and reverence are not always opposites. A later community might alter an image precisely because it still mattered. Even Spreich has offered one preliminary interpretation. Groups arriving from farther north during a later period may have carried different values and deliberately altered Minanbe's political symbolism. That is a hypothesis to test, not evidence of a proven invasion. Fieldwork has not established who these people were when they arrived, whether their arrival was violent or how they related to the existing population. The people who changed the monuments may not have been strangers. They could have been later residents, descendants, rivals, ritual specialists, or several groups acting at different times. The fractures and unusual positions do not yet tell us whether there was one coordinated episode or a longer sequence of reuse. This uncertainty is not outside the story. It is part of what Minanbe preserves. The site does not preserve one uncontested political message. It preserves an original attempt to make authority permanent and evidence that permanence failed. First, rulers or other authorities placed carved bodies in public space. They used regalia, inscriptions, and calendar signs to turn hierarchy into history. In AD 849, that language included an apparent decapitation. The stone presented power as visible, violent, and ordered. Then later hands intervened. They left no readable manifesto. Their actions survive as fractures, displacement, and altered relationships between stones and space. We should not pretend to know their motive, but they demonstrate something the original commissioners could not control. Future people would decide what the monuments meant, where they stood, and whether royal images remained whole. The paradox is simple. History is never truly written in stone, only loaned to stone. The rulers of Minanbe tried to command memory. The archaeological record preserves both their claim and the limit of their command. That is why this modest city matters. A great capital can display political power at its height. Minanbe may preserve something more intimate, the moment when official memory no longer belonged only to those who created it. But the people who took hold of that memory remain unnamed. To find them, archaeology must follow a road that LiDAR cannot draw. Minanbe first appeared as geometry beneath a forest. Reaching it required approximately 5 kilometers of trail to be opened, then another 5 or 6 kilometers on foot. Understanding it will be a longer journey. The inscriptions must be documented and deciphered. Ceramics must refine the chronology. Excavation must determine when monuments were erected, when they were moved, and whether their fractures belong to one episode or several. Regional comparisons may reveal connections, but they may also uncover a history unique to this small city. For now, its ancient name is unknown. The ruler on Monument 6 remains unnamed. The figures on Stela 1 are unidentified. A D849 records a political message, not an abandonment date. And the people who changed the stones left actions without names. Minanbe means approximately, there is no road. At first, the name described the forest. Now it describes the boundary of knowledge. LiDAR can reveal the path to a city. Archaeology can recover pieces of its argument. But the evidence does not yet justify certainty. At Minanbe, the road of intended permanence ends where later hands begin. Beyond that point, for now, there is no single road, only stones marked by different hands across centuries.